In the 2 decades since Columbine, video games have been at the center of the controversy surrounding gun violence in America. In 2019 alone, there have been more than 250 mass shootings. When the president spoke on Monday about last weekend's shootings, he focused on the video game industry.
We must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop.
James Ivory joins us now. He's a professor and a director of research and outreach for the Department of Communication at Virginia Tech. So, Professor Ivory, what's the evidence show? Does violence and video games, is there a correlation between the two?
When it comes to actual serious criminal violence, there's virtually no evidence that video games really matter. We do know a lot of things that influence violent crime, and what we do with our time on TV, video games, things like that, that's not one of them. There is a little more interest in research that's on kind of links between playing a lot of games and like the more abstract forms of aggression. But again, when it comes to serious violent crime, video games don't really matter.
Just last year, a study was commissioned by the Trump administration that found no conclusive evidence that violent games had any correlation to mass shootings. So why are we constantly blaming these heinous crimes on video games?
I think there are a couple reasons. One is probably a little more well-meaning than the other. One kind of well-meaning reason is I think it's very intuitive for us to see bloodshed and gore on a TV screen and say, this has to do something to us. And it might, but again, with all the things that we know are very strong predictors of violent crime, poverty, substance abuse in the house, child abuse, things like that matter a lot. Video games don't really matter much when it comes to serious violent crime, as that study you mentioned said, and as the research community agrees. I think another reason that we like to point to video games is because we don't want to talk about other things that we know are much more likely to be relevant.
It is a difficult conversation to have. You're absolutely right. We know this platform 8chan, where the manifesto and others were posted. It's known to have a large video game community. It's also known for hateful rhetoric. What do you say to those people who point out to that fact to try and justify video games and violence go hand in hand?
Well, now there is some research on people who try to predict what are the factors that lead to people being involved in hate speech and hate crime. And one of them is involvement in online communities. Now, of course, this is not to say that online communities are in and of themselves bad. But as you mentioned, there are certain online communities that seem to foster people who feel hard done by, who might have either be already interested in kind of hate group type of activity, or maybe they get groomed into it there. So online communities, some of them, at least, can foster some hateful behavior. Often these online communities are full of young men who feel disenfranchised, and young men are also interested in video games. This is a common problem they call the base rate fallacy, where you see a lot of young men doing things that other young men do. So you say, oh, the perpetrator played video games. That's true, but so do most young men.
In your research, have you seen a difference on how this issue of video games is brought up depending on the suspect's race?
Yeah, we've actually done some research on that ourselves. Some of the research was led by some people that I work with up in Villanova and Philadelphia, so I have to give them credit. But just recently, we finished a study where we did a lab study here and found that when we showed people a violent crime that was committed by either a white or black suspect, it was basically a mock news story, people were more comfortable with the idea that video games might have played a role if the suspect was white. We also know from looking at almost 7,000 news stories about mass shootings that with school shootings, at least, video games are more than 8 times more likely to be mentioned when the perpetrator is white. White people don't play video games more than people of color. So we believe this is sort of evidence that perhaps with some people we go looking for excuses more than others. If a person's race, if other things about a person fit the stereotype of that we want for a criminal, maybe we don't go looking for excuses. And then maybe with certain perpetrators, basically young white men, we might look harder for excuses. So I think a lot of the talk about games might tell us more about the way we think about crime than actually games themselves.
That is fascinating. 8 times more likely to mention video games if they're white. That's so fascinating to hear you say that. You know, Hillary Clinton took to Twitter to condemn the president's comment, saying people suffer from mental illness in every other country on earth. People play video games in virtually every other country. The difference is the guns. Is there anything in your research that points to whether other countries have problems? Japan's a huge video gaming industry. They don't seem to have this problem.
Yeah, I want to be careful to stay in my area of expertise. I study video games. I'm not a mental health professional, and I'm not an expert on firearm violence per se. But I think when we say that we know that violent video games don't have a unique effect on violent crime, as you mentioned, we don't see these kind of problems in other countries where there's a lot of violent video game use. I don't think I have the kind of expertise to point directly to a cause, but I think conversations about proliferation of guns and things like that are more relevant, at least, to this conversation. Again, I'm not sure I'm well equipped to lay a certain cause, but I think there are certain things we're unwilling to at least talk about, and certainly a lot of them have to do with firearm policy.
So, Professor Ivory, if there was one thing you can point out to the political world who tend to use the video game argument for their own political benefit, what do you want politicians on Capitol Hill to know about the use of video games and violence?
I think it's definitely time we come around to the idea that study after study shows that when it comes to serious violent crime, particularly when it comes to mass crime, it's a little bit of a waste of time and a distraction to talk about media use. Now, again, I think it's okay morally to have a problem with celebrating violence. It's okay to even say maybe playing video games a lot does something to you, but it definitely doesn't make you a mass shooter. There are other things that affect that. And I think a lot of the people that I would like to tell that, though, I think some of these politicians already know that, and they don't want to talk about what we probably should be talking about.
Professor James Ivory, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.